the recording. So as I said, we're going to record this. I also encourage you all to introduce yourselves in the chat. We're not going to have time to do a formal introduction time for everyone here. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat and also share your contact info if you're open to connecting with your comrades and your colleagues. I think there's going to, a lot of you have a lot of wisdom that you can share with each other in addition to our presenters. So in the interest of time, I am going to start things and I'm going to share my slides. Okay, let me get to slide 1. So I am Jamie Jeanette. I'm with Health, Housing, and Homeless Services, and we are the CoC lead, which means we're kind of helping coordinate the homeless system of care for Contra Costa. And okay, are my slides showing appropriately?
Yes.
Do we see? Okay, CoC
Yes.
training. Great. Okay.
Well,
Jamie,
I'm
can you
seeing-
swap the presenter mode thing?
Yes.
Yes.
That's interesting. Yes, hold on, display settings. Okay. Yeah? Better?
Yes.
Okay, great. I feel like I have like 2 screens and running the Zoom and the slides. This is going to be fun. So just a few little housekeeping things. So we're asking folks, as I said, to please mute yourselves so that we minimize the chaos. Feel free, as there's time for questions or as you have questions as we go, you can put things in the chat, and there's folks on the team that are reading the chat and will help cue to the presenters. There will also be time for you to like raise your virtual hand if you have questions. As I said, we're going to send out an email afterwards with the recording and the slides, so don't worry about that. And then I'm going to just do a really quick poll. So we are doing, we're starting to do this year, the who's in the room poll, because part of what we like to track is who we're having in our meetings and our trainings and how well that is matching who's in our homeless system of care, to make sure that we're getting the right folks in the room for all these trainings. So the first question's about race and ethnicity, and you can choose all that apply. The second is about whether or not you've experienced unsheltered homelessness in the past 7 years. And the third is what best describes your agency. And the fourth is what best describes your role. And again, this is just helps us see who's coming to our trainings. So we're going to let that continue for a minute. And then while that's happening, I'm just going to continue on to talk about the training norms and agreements. So these are pretty basic, but respect the trainers, respect your fellow attendees. And the last 3 are really about just having an awareness of yourself and your personality and also your power and privilege. So basically how much space you're taking up or not taking up. So encouraging folks who tend to hang back to step forward and ask questions or share. And those of us like me who are big blabbermouths, maybe simmer down today. Just a little bit about these trainings. So for many of you, this is a repeat, but for new folks, so we do these trainings every month and we host them on the second Monday of every month from 10 to noon. Occasionally, if there's like a holiday Monday, we'll bump it, but we'll let you know. And these are required for direct service staff and for program managers. And it's really so that we can make sure that everyone has the same information and basic set of skills that are considered essential either by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is our biggest funder, or what we have decided as a system of care is important. Okay, you don't have to really look at this closely, but this is, sometimes we're going to give you breadcrumbs for why we're doing this training. So this is these elements that HUD is requiring that tie into this training. So again, you're going to get these slides later, but just wanted to let you know that information is there. Shelby, anything you want to say on this piece?
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. Good morning, everyone. Shelby Ferguson, Continuum of Care Administrator with H3. Just a reminder that, like Jamie said, the trainings are required monthly for direct service providers, and we'll be talking about them during our quarterly meetings. Thanks.
Great. Okay. The other thing is that we really want folks with all the work we do to have what we would call an equity lens. And that really means thinking about the way things may be unequal. So thinking about inequities in your own work on this topic, these are some questions for you to think about. Are there certain populations, whether it's race, ethnicity, is it sexual orientation, is it gender, is it age? Are you noticing big differences in different groups? Are there things that maybe you have done that are contributing to these unequal experiences, or are you seeing things and you're interrupting them? And then thinking about what kind of barriers might still exist or might be contributing to this, and how might they be addressed? So these are just things for you to hold in your mind as we're going through this training to think about. And then I'm going to turn it over to our trainers. So we have Gina Bills and Alejandra Chamberlain from the that should be Contra Costa Office of Ed, not CCUSD. I've made up a new agency. And Rosie Reed from Mount Diablo Unified. And with that, I'm going to mute myself.
Okay, thank you, Jamie. So as she mentioned, I'm Alejandra Chamberlain. I'm the Director of Youth Services for the Contra Costa County Office of Education. We appreciate that you're here and that you stay present with us as we provide this information to you all so you can serve our families and children and youth who are in our school districts and also interacting with your systems, your agencies. Next slide. There's our beautiful faces, just in case you needed to know who's who. And I guess, you know what, I will stop right now and let Gina and Rosie introduce themselves.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Gina Bills. I'm the Education Liaison here at the County Office of Education, coordinating our homeless ed programs countywide.
And I am Rosie Reed, she, her pronouns. I work for Mount Diablo Unified School District, and we serve several of the cities that I know many of you serve: Pleasant Hill, Concord, Walnut Creek, Pacheco, Bay Point, parts of Martinez, so Clayton. So we've got a wide range of areas that we serve.
And as you probably could tell when Gina spoke, her little box did not light up, and that is because we are in the same office using my sound system. So just in case you were like, where's Gina and why didn't her little box light up? Next slide. So you all already did this. It was our hope to make sure we know who's in the room, how many years you've been with the CoC. That would give us a sense of how much information do we need to provide as we're going through the slides and doing more of the digging deeper. So if you don't mind just putting how many years you've been part of the CoC or doing this work, that will give me a better sense, as well as Rosie and Gina, with regards to the in-depth information we will discuss as we go through the slides. So feel free to do that. I appreciate it. In the chat will be great. And if you already did your name or provided your name, your title, and your agency, no need to do that. Just put the years, that will help us. Next slide. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of the county, and then we will narrow it down as I go through these next slides. So TK to 12 enrollment throughout our county for you all is 169,394. And when it comes to our charters in our county, we have 13,000 and a little more. There's 287 schools, 18 districts. So that gives you a sense of how many schools we're talking about, how many districts we're talking about. Charters, I believe, were right around, what would you say, Gina, 30? About 30. Forgive me for not having that number on this slide. Next slide. And then that gives you an overview of when you're thinking about our population as a whole, as a county. That is the different subcategories or populations. So English language learners, foster youth, youth experiencing homelessness, and so forth. And so when you think about the larger percentage In regards to youth and children experiencing homelessness, it is 1.4% of the larger. So it's not a lot, but when you look at the actual number, still quite a bit of a number. And it actually has increased since this particular slide was part of the annual report that our County Office of Ed provides. You'll see that in the next slide, or a couple slides down. So Youth Services is a department within student programs, and our primary focus is to provide goodness, that word is just not for that Monday morning. I'm going to blame it on the spring forward, but that's probably just my Latina accent that's having a hard time. A wide range of coordinated services for youth, children, and families. And then in addition to that, we also provide technical assistance and professional development for all of our 18 districts and our charters. Plus, we get the opportunity to partner with our community colleges, probation, justice involved system, from the public defenders and all the community organizations that provide support to them, as well as child welfare, H3. So we almost are like that liaison between the school districts and all of our stakeholders who are supporting either children in foster care or experiencing homelessness or involved in the juvenile justice system. Next slide. Within that broad range of like what we do, we have a couple of different programs. So we have the Education for Homeless Children and Youth, which is primarily what we're here to share and represent. And then the other programs we support or have under the Youth Services are the Foster Youth Services Coordinating Program, our Empowerment Program, Workforce, and then Wellness in Schools. Next slide. So our time together, well, really, we hope that when you finish this presentation, one, you'll know who to call, either Gina or myself, if you don't know already, to call us when you have any questions. But really what we want you to think about is, as you're working with your families, to take the time to think about their educational needs for the children and to think about what would be the best placement for them as you're thinking about education. Sometimes we know that's hard and it doesn't work out perfectly, but to stop and take the moment to process around that would be really intentional and mindful around making sure there's school stability, as well as how to inform families of their children and unaccompanied youth education rights, and what rights and services they have in regards to the protection under the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. And then how can we collaborate with each other? Not only you all under the CoC, but also thinking about our liaisons at the school sites, as well as the County Office of Ed, and everyone who has the opportunity to support the children and youth experiencing homelessness. Next slide. So, question, how many students were identified as homeless in Contra Costa County during the 23-24 year? And I believe we have a poll. Yes, we do. So take a vote. Let us know what you think. There is going to be a right answer, but that's okay if you get it wrong. I'm going to vote as well. I get to cheat because I know the answer. Okay. Jamie, do you have those answers already, or can you show those? Okay, so most of you were guessing about 1,265. Some of you guessed 3,346. And the answer is, next slide, 3,346 were identified. So it has increased. I'll say a little bit about why we believe it has increased. I won't speak too much, but just to tease you, as you can see, a couple years ago, we were at 2,896 in 2018, 2019. And then you can see the dip in 21, 22. And the increase, we believe, has to do with one, there was ARP money that was given to districts to help with the requirement around the housing questionnaire. So it is now required that every school district have a housing questionnaire at enrollment at a very minimum. Ideally, they also send out the housing questionnaire midpoint. And if they are, exciting districts that are really on top of everything, they're sending it more than twice a year. But we understand it gets really busy and they're doing the best they can. In addition, we also know that some of the districts were able to bring on additional staff and therefore were able to really do outreach. And so part of that as well was just Gina's time in connecting with the districts, ensuring that the housing questionnaire was implemented and so forth. And I'm sure Rosie could speak to some of the practices that Mount Diablo Unified School District took. But overall, we are not surprised that the number has increased. That is probably closer to what we know is happening. And like we all acknowledge, often what we find is that families are not disclosing that they're experiencing homelessness for many reasons. So next slide. And I'm going to pass it over to Gina.
Thanks, Alejandra. So when it comes to our homeless population, who are our homeless youth? Well, they are identified as homeless under the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. Next slide, please. So a little history on the act. The McKinney-Vento Act started back in 1987. It was originally known as the Stuart v. McKinney Act. And when it got signed into law, it was asking states to really look at the requirements when it came to residency and our homeless children and youth and the problems that they were facing when it came to getting in school. But then in 1990, it came back as just the McKinney Act, but this time it was required for all states to eliminate the barriers that those students were facing, and also throwing in some additional school supports in order for our homeless children and youth to succeed academically. But the McKinney-Vento Act still wasn't done, so in 1994, it came back, this time adding ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act. It also started to include our little guys, our preschool services, asking for input from parents, and then really asking districts to implement an interagency collaboration and agreement. So almost a decade went by, and then it came back as the McKinney-Vento Act that we know and love today, but this time it was a requirement for every district to appoint a liaison, really making sure that the law was being implemented effectively. Next slide, please. So what is the McKinney-Vento Act? So it's a federal law that makes sure that our children and youth experiencing homelessness are accessing and really getting the rights and protections under the Act. The McKinney-Vento Act also authorizes funding through the EHCY program, so it comes down at a federal level. That money goes to the California Department of Ed. California Department of Ed then distributes those funds. And really the overarching kind of guiding light under the McKinney-Vento Act is making sure that all children and youth experiencing homelessness have equal and immediate access to public education. So same exact rights and services as their housed peers. And then overall providing educational support to promote school success. And the act includes not only LEAs, so all of our district sites, but also our charter schools, as well as our county offices of education. Next slide. So what is homelessness when it comes to the McKinney-Vento Act? The definition is individuals and families lacking a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. But then the McKinney-Vento Act also goes on to include additional situations. So that includes our children, families, and youth staying in hotels, motels, that are staying with other families, doubled up. So those are your folks that are couch surfing. Individuals living in cars, any buildings not fit for habitation, so condemned building or shelters and housing agencies. Next slide. So a little more context when it comes to fixed, regular, and adequate under the McKinney-Vento Act. So a fixed residence is just that. It's stationary, it's permanent, it's not going anywhere. So an example of a fixed residence would be an apartment, where as an example of a residence that is not fixed would be a tent. A regular residence, so use just that, right? On a regular, nightly, ongoing basis. So an example of a regular residence would be a family that has a legal right to be in the home, say a rental agreement. Whereas an example of a residence that is not regular would be your doubled up folks, your couch surfers. They could be asked to leave at any time. They don't have any legal recourse to be in the home. An adequate residence sufficiently meets the physical and psychological needs for shelter. So an adequate space would be able to provide enough space for the number of individuals living in the home. So an example of an adequate residence would be a transitional housing facility, where an example of an inadequate residence would be an abandoned building. Next slide.
Okay, thank you, Gina.
You're welcome.
So as you think about what Gina has provided in regards to how the McKinney-Vento defines homelessness, and you think about the fixed, regular, and adequate, that is the definition our districts are using to identify children and youth experiencing homelessness. So here you have the overall list of that 3,346 students who we identified during the 23-24 year, broken down by each district. As you can see, Antioch Unified School District identified 420, Mount Diablo Unified School District 861, and West Contra Costa Unified School District 705. So they're throughout the 18 districts. It varies and it does fluctuate year to year, but for the most part, it stays around the same amount when the district does their process of identifying and certifying that the students who are experiencing homelessness really are. Next slide. If you're curious and you love data and you want to dig a little deeper, there is a website, and we'll make sure to provide the link where you could find out more information district by district in regards to homeless enrollment, as well as K-12. So it breaks it down district by district, all the information. And the next slide gives you an example. So in this example, it shows you, thank you, Jamie, for the 23-24 year. And you could dig deep in regards to particularly within our county and then the 18 districts and so forth. I'm sure that it will be very similar to what we see in the point in time count. We know that we often see higher numbers in East County and in West County. And what we do experience, though, is that because there's not a shelter for youth, often they leave our county. So that's the number that might be a little different in regards to what the point in time count would actually show. And moving on to our next slide, I'm going to hand it over to Rosie.
So as I said at the beginning, I am a McKinney-Vento liaison for Mount Diablo Unified School District. And I think one of the key takeaways here is just knowing that every district has a liaison and getting to know the liaisons in your area. I know that there are several of you on the call. I was just going through the participants list, and we work super closely together to support families because we all want the same thing, right? We all want our students to go to school and have success in school. And so often that really great communication with you as educational partners can really help. Same thing for me. If I have a new student and I'm not familiar with their McKinney-Vento liaison, I Google it. Who's the McKinney-Vento liaison for Lodi, right? And then I figure out who Lodi is, and then I call that person. And then that's how we support students in transitioning to our school district, but also again, in working with you all, the community. So make sure you know who your people are in your area, who you can work with. We do always sign an ROI, or release of information, to be able to exchange information. So that's something that you could do, have them sign an ROI, or we can do it, or we can both do that. But once we have that strong partnership and relationship with the signed ROI, we really can make a lot of progress for our students. So there's a document there that shares at the bottom. You can see there's a little link. And that has the contact information for all of the liaisons in Contra Costa County. I will say that Alejandra and Gina do a great job of doing a lot of trainings for us. So the things that we're going to go over in the next several slides, I'd say that they've trained us up on great. And everyone's doing all these things, hopefully. It's hard for me. I have a harder time once we go outside of the county because it's not as consistent. So really shout out to Alejandra and Gina and the CCCOE for doing a really great job with making sure we understand students' rights, so that way we can enforce them and make sure that students have those rights. Next slide, please. So the first and most important thing is that if you come with someone to enroll or help the students enroll, you should see this poster. It's usually posted, and whatever the student, whatever populations they have 10% in or more, they will have those languages posted. But it's just helping families understand that they can enroll immediately without all of the necessary documents that a student would typically need to have to enroll. So whether it's their immunizations or birth certificate or ID, a lease, any of that, they can enroll today without those things. It doesn't mean they don't ever need to get them, but they can get started going to school today. Next slide, please. So I wanted to ask you all, and you can go ahead and put in the chat, how can this information about educational rights be incorporated into the intake process? How do you use that process when you're working with a new family as you're doing intake? You can go ahead and write your answer into the chat, or can they come off mute, Jamie, or are they all muted?
People can unmute. We might want to
Okay.
have folks do their little raise the hand thing, just so
Okay,
we
raise the hand thing.
don't have
Okay.
14 people talking at the same time.
Perfect, absolutely. So I don't serve West County. That's there. So you could look and see who the West County representatives are, depending on where you are in West County. But on that link in the previous slide, it would tell you who the liaisons are in your area. So the list will be sent out to all of the liaisons along with the slide deck, and it's also embedded in that link.
So this is, oops, sorry.
Go.
I was going to say, this is a good opportunity to step up. If you have a
Yeah.
question, you can unmute or raise your hand. Have any of you had families that you've worked with that have had questions or struggled with enrollment?
I see Kisty.
Yes. Good morning, Rosie. Good morning,
Hi.
everyone. Kisty Jimenez. I'm a case manager for Hope Solutions for the TAPE population. And I was just going to say, as a parent that has children registered in Contra Costa County, I don't think I've ever seen this form in like registration packets. So it may be useful to have it. I would just say for me and for my children at their school to have it like at the time of registration. And I don't see it posted like in the school. I don't know if that's something that should be posted in the schools, as you were mentioning, but I have not seen it, to be honest.
Thank you. That's good feedback. Are you talking about like an actual form that would go home to families?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I
It
don't
would be
think we
to-
send it home to families. It's just posted in the office, but
Oh, okay.
we can talk about that with Gina and Alejandra if that would
Yeah,
be.
it's a good tip
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
could definitely be easily incorporated. They do have those posters in a PDF that we could share with all the liaisons. That's a good tip.
Anybody else have any other questions or challenges that you've had with immediate enrollment for students? Okay, we can go on to the next slide. So the rights and services that are the most important to understand for McKinney-Vento students are that right to immediate enrollment, but also the right to school of origin, and we'll look at that in just a moment, and that we'll explain what that means in a second. Transportation and graduation protections. So let's go ahead on to the next slide. So immediate enrollment is what we were just talking about, that students experiencing homelessness can enroll today. They can also start school today. So enrollment is not just you're enrolling the student, but then we're waiting for transportation for 2 weeks, or we're going to enroll them, but then wait for them to go get their immunizations. No, they can enroll and start attending today. That's what the McKinney Act preserves, is both the right to enrollment and attendance. One thing that is really important for us to remind families when we're working with them is, like I said, this does not mean they never need to get a birth certificate. They never need to get immunization. So often as a student who meets the legal criteria for homelessness, you can get a free birth certificate for that student. You can get a free copy of a California ID for the parent. So there are ways we can help assist with that, but we do need them. The immunizations are not a forever pass. You still need to go out and get them. We do just want to get the student started as quickly as possible. Next slide, please. So we have a case scenario here. So let's assume that you're working with a family, and during an intake assessment, a parent shares that their 2 children, ages 8 and 13, have been attending school only once a week since the family has been living in their vehicle. What questions can be asked to better understand the family's needs? You can either unmute or raise your hand and we will call on you, or you can put your answer in the chat. I know some of you on here personally, and I know that you work with families and help them enroll. So I'm gonna cold call you pretty soon. What do you do to help support the students and the families in getting connected to school?
I give you permission to turn up the hot seat.
Okay. Ask about needs around transportation to school. Yeah, that's very, very important. I know that in our district, the most typical thing is that you would get bus passes or a Clipper card. How long have they been in the vehicle? Yeah, absolutely. How long have the students not been attending school regularly? Kind of goes with that question. That's a great one. Where is the student currently enrolled is another one that we'd want to consider. If they're farther away, do we need to transfer them, or do we want to go there? How can I support you? Ask about needs for gas, other resources for transportation. Okay. Great. Yeah. So at this point, we would look at the family and say, do we need to support them in attending their school of origin, which we will look at in just a moment, or do we want to help them transfer to our district so it's easier for them to get to school? Do either of the children have disabilities? Absolutely. Great questions. We need to track down that IEP. Good one. I'd ask what gets in the way of them getting their children to school. Other resources in the area. Ask about their access to food for the family. Yes. Absolutely. So those are all the same kinds of questions we ask when we do an intake with the family. We also, do they need school supplies? Do they need backpacks? Do they need clothes? We have a lot of, gently used sweatshirts and things like that in our room, jackets. But we can also place an order once a year for students to get new clothes in our district. I know each district kind of handles that a little bit differently. So that, do they need some clothes to be able to go to school? What is their income? Do they have an income? Absolutely. Church resources, yeah, are they connected to any local churches? We always give them a recommendation. We give them some lists of churches and other food pantries and things like that that are close to where they're staying the majority of the time. Those are great questions. Okay, next slide, please. So school of origin for homeless youth is really important because the goal of school of origin is to maintain school stability. Every time we have a student move schools due to homelessness, we see about 4 to 6 months worth of learning loss. So it's really important if we can to try to maintain school of origin. So the school of origin could be the school the student attended before they became unhoused. So when they were last permanently housed, the school that the student was last enrolled at, or it could be this any school in the last 15 months where they have a strong connection. So they might have even left the area, left that school. They're no longer there. Maybe it was 2 or 3 schools ago, but it was within the last 15 months and they want to go back to that school. They do have a right to re-enroll at that school. West Contra Costa has Julie Lura. She's on there. I'm seeing a question about West Contra Costa. And so that would be Julie Lura. Perfect. Yeah, I think that's why, because it's not school by school. So she does all of those schools. So school of origin is really important because then we can talk to the family about, like I said, do you want to transfer to our school district, or do we want help getting back to the other school district? Next slide, please. So school of origin, just kind of continuing on this, is that the students have the right to stay in their school of origin, even if they become stably housed. So let's say in February, the family, gets a lease, so they get Section 8 housing. They have a right to continue going to the school of origin until the end of the school year, if they're in TK through 8th grade, or until the end of high school, if they're in grades 9 through 12. Next slide, please. So school of origin transportation, we do need to provide transportation to students and families to attend school. An important distinction is it's not always the kind of transportation that they would most prefer. So, we have to take a look at the situation and figure out what is a reasonable way for this family to get to school. Let's say we have a second grader going to school. We might provide bus passes for the student and for the parent. I know most parents often want gas cards. Gas cards are not our first resort, also because it's hard for us to monitor the gas cards. And when we give out a family a gas card, we end up using it in a lot of ways other than going to and from school. So gas cards are kind of, for our district, not one of the first things that we look at. We look at first at bus passes and Clipper cards and things like that, so we can make sure that they're using them to take the students to and from school. But gas cards can be an option. Also, there is the possibility of hop, skip, drive, which is like a door-to-door service. Families also always really want that, because wouldn't that be convenient, right? But that's typically for very extreme situations where it's a student who cannot possibly get there on their own. In public transportation, the parent can't take them, or maybe there is no public transportation from point A to point B. And that might be a situation where we'd look at hop, skip, drive. It's important to understand that hop, skip, drive is incredibly expensive. We're looking at more than $40,000 a year per student just to go to school, often on average. And it can be a lot more than that, depending on if they're much further away. So that's why that one is last resort. Let's see here. Yeah, and it does include preschools. We do include preschools in the transportation, and the formerly homeless student can have the transportation till the end of the year, even if they become housed. Next slide, please. Am I passing this back to Gina, or is this one me here?
It's okay. You
okay.
covered a couple slides. I'm happy to jump in whenever you
go
are
ahead.
ready to have me jump in.
You take it. You take it.
I didn't want to interrupt you. I was like, oh, she's taking my slides. That's okay.
Yeah, you go for it. It's all yours.
So scenario 2, you forgive me. You are assisting a family that's staying at Shelter Inc., Mountain View Family Shelter. Their high school age child was previously enrolled in a high school in Brentwood before being placed in emergency housing. Which is the school of origin? Which is the school of residence? And how can the school and the shelter work together to support the students' academic stability? We have an awfully quiet.
It's Monday morning.
It's Monday morning, so I can understand.
Someone saying school of origin would be Brentwood.
Brentwood, yeah. And then school of residency obviously would be
Martinez.
They might need to know where Mountain View is. Do they all know where
right.
Mountain View is?
Yeah, Martinez, yeah.
Yeah, that would be the school of residence, right?
Mhm.
Is it Martinez? Okay.
Yep. And how can the school and the shelter work together to support the academic stability of the child? So in other words, like, what would be the process like if you're the agency, whether it is Shelter Inc. or any other agency who's working with two different districts? And it could be whether it's a high school student or whether it's an elementary kiddo. Develop a plan for transportation to Brentwood if the child has a strong connection to Brentwood. Absolutely. And when you're thinking about that plan, I'm going to assume you pull out your list of your district liaisons. You get in touch with your district liaison at Brentwood. You get in touch with the district liaison at Mountain View and let them know they have a shared kid. We encourage them to have a conversation. Often we consider this conversation a bid, a best interest determination meeting, which would then allow the two districts to talk about, is it in the best interest for the kiddo to stay in the school of origin? And often that is the case. There are situations where it's not, but that bid allows individuals to come together, have a genuine conversation about what's working well, what's not working well, and can that other district who's closer to the kiddo still provide those same services? And often it might be a yes and it might be a no, but until you bring all the parties together, then everyone's able to understand, is it in the best interest? And I'm reading the chat. Give me a second.
And just keeping in mind also, like I said, we always need to get that release of information to work with outside partners.
Thank you, Rosie. Yes, that is true. Victoria?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear
Okay.
you.
I used to work at the Mountain View shelter, and what we would do if children would come in that were in a different district, of a different school, and they moved to Martinez to be in the shelter, we would just work with the families and help them get in contact with the schools that were nearby, just give them support in that way, so that they weren't doing it on their own and feeling like overwhelmed. Um, and we just help them gather information on different schools and stuff.
Yeah, thank you, Victoria.
Can I just add what Victoria said is important to know the schools in your area? Because in Victoria, you're in the Mountain View area, you are looking at Martinez, and they enroll directly to a school site in Martinez. In Mount Diablo Unified School District, it all goes through one centralized enrollment process. So again, getting to know what is that process like in your area, because some places you're going to send the family straight to the school. If you send the family straight to the school in the Mount Diablo Unified, they've often just wasted public transportation or gas to get to a school, and then they have to go back across Concord and then get to the place where they need to go to enroll. So that was a really great point.
I just want to add one more thing. What was really cool about the schools in the area of the shelter is that they were all very familiar with that location. And so they were super helpful on the transition.
Yeah, and that makes sense, right? Get to know your partners in your community, particularly in this case, your schools, school sites, your district liaisons. And do that ahead of time, right? If you know that there is a district liaison that you want to be introduced to and you haven't been successful, reach out to Gina and I, and we're happy to make that connection. Most of our liaisons do want to know who's in the community, how are you supporting children and youth, and can we be proactive? And acknowledging what Rosie said in regards to having permission to have that conversation around a particular child or youth is important. And also, you can encourage the family to be their own advocates and to reach out to the liaison themselves, right? And then be able to make that connection. That can be overwhelming, but you will have to determine that, which parent or which caregiver is able to take that on and which one do you need to support a little bit more with phone calls and so forth.
Alejandra, there was a question in the chat about who signs the ROI, and it is both the family and the school district would sign or the family would sign the ROI, and then they would give it to us if it's ours or the other way around. So typically you guys would just have the family sign it on your end. And also just to follow up on what Alejandra said about making sure families are advocating for themselves too. I know that 2 of you on this call emailed me last week about a family that was having a really hard time with the school. And they had some, big problems that they were having. And I went and I followed up with the principal, and the principal in each case said, I talked to this parent every single day and they never mentioned any of this. So making sure that we're really empowering our parents to have those conversations with the principals, bring in the liaison if they're not being successful, but to start out with those conversations with the principal directly rather than having you go through me, it's like, wait a minute, you should have just told them and they would have addressed it. Because both times the principals were like, I wish they had said something to me.
Thank you, Rosie. That is an important part to consider, right? Any other thoughts or questions or comments in regards to school of origin, school of residency, and working with the districts to provide support? Erica?
I just want to say, Rosie, sometimes our parents have their own trauma with schools from their own childhood, and sometimes it's not as easy for them to be able to communicate with the principal, and they find that the relationship that they have either with us or someone else is the easiest way to advocate for themselves and their children.
Absolutely. I do acknowledge that. That's one thing we know. Everybody has gone through a school system and their experience is individual. And I think this is where it gives us an opportunity to come together as a community and think about all of the different layers, right? Whether it is you as a particular provider supporting that parent directly, keeping the liaison up to date, whether it's bringing in the liaison to speak to the parent, whether it's bringing Gina in, right? Like there's so many of us who want the best for our kiddos. And I think that's the takeaway. Like figure out what makes sense for that family. Do they just need the resources and tools and they got it on their own? Do they need you to be more involved? Can the liaison be of support? Keeping in mind that often, not always, because just like there are some really great nurses and doctors, and I won't call on our own field because that feels a little shaming, but nurses and doctors, there's really crappy nurses and doctors, right? And so acknowledging that, always keep in mind the school site, but we understand there's dynamics that sometimes are not the best match for that particular family. But I could guarantee you for the most part, and I say that lightly because obviously we're still human. Our liaisons that are on the list that we provided, they are amazing and they really lead with their hearts and really want to serve our families. So if you usually get the liaison involved, they will do whatever it takes to support. Okay, there are no other thoughts or comments on that. We will move on to graduation. So as we continue to think about, forgive me, I have like a little tickle in my throat. As we continue to think about school stability and making sure that kiddos are 1, enrolled, and then 2, we're thinking about school of origin, school residency, what's the best fit, transportation. The next thing to think about is graduation. Obviously, this is for older kiddos, and there is an opportunity to case by case look at a student's situation and determine can they qualify or opt in to graduate with a reduced graduation, a state graduation exemption. And that is every district sets the amount of credits that a student has to earn in order to graduate. The state minimum requirement is 130. It most likely will change in the next couple years because they've added 2 more courses, but I won't go down that path. But right now it's 130. And how students could potentially qualify for the 130 as opposed to the 220. Rosie, how many credits is it for your district?
If you're at a non-alt-ed school, at a comprehensive high school, it's 220. But if you're at an alternative education or continuation school, it's 200 because they don't have to take PE.
And then for the state is 130. So obviously you can see there's a difference there. And so if there is a kiddo who is experiencing homelessness and you want to see could they potentially qualify, A, you could memorize this slide, or B, you could loop in the liaison and they will figure it out for you. But if you want to know this just as a way to be able to support your student, one, they obviously have to be in foster care, experiencing homelessness and so forth, and then transfer during their second year from one school to another school or one district to another district, and are significantly behind in credits. So the intention is not to graduate students early. That's never the intention with this, as well as we would notify them, and then the parent or caregiver would be the one who would be the ed rights holder for unaccompanied youth. They are their own ed rights holder who could sign off on this requirement. Next slide.
Can I just say one more thing about that?
Yeah,
though?
absolutely.
It's important to make sure that families and students know that if they do the credit exemption, then they're not A through G eligible to go straight to a four-year college. So that doesn't mean it's not a really good option for some of our students, but they should always know that that is a piece of it.
Yeah. So what are they eligible for, Rosie, if they're not eligible for a 4-year?
They are eligible for a 2-year college or like a CTE pathway or some sort of a job readiness program. But we want to make sure we're giving the students that information.
So it's obviously an option, and it might be great for some, but not for all, especially those who want to go to a 4-year. So then you might be asking, okay, well, if they're behind in credits and they want to go to a 4-year, but they're not going to graduate on time, then what option are you giving them? So there is this part of it, which is this slide here, that gives them the right to stay a 5th year. So hopefully a 5th year would allow them to get the last credits that they would need in order to graduate. That's not always the case, but they also could ask for the graduation reduction plus stay a 5th year in order to meet all of the credits. So there's some flexibility. I don't expect you all to memorize this. The intention really is to be involved in as you're working with the students in regards to there's options, and then looping in the liaison, and then they take care of that eligibility component and screening and so forth.
One
But
piece that I was
as-
going to add on to this piece. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
Alejandra.
No,
Well,
go ahead, Rosie.
So because Alejandra and Gina and I present together sometimes, and they're like, here's the law, here's what it's going to look like. And then I'm like, and then here's notes from the field. Here's what actually ends up happening. So while all students do have the, who are in McKinney-Vento or foster youth or the different groups, have the right to that 5th year, we're not seeing great outcomes for that as an option. So we just ran the data on the last 2 years, and it was only about 40% of the students who went for the 5th year have either graduated at this point now in March or are still attending and on track to graduate within that 5th year. So we are finding that that graduation, the credit exemption of graduating the students at 130 is the better option of the two in terms of finishing, because we know that ultimately without a high school diploma, life is going to be really, really hard, right? So we keep that in mind, that you can also get both. You could get the 130 and then you don't get to the 130, the credit exemption, and then you do the 5th year to finish the 130, and those students are typically finishing.
Thank you, Rosie. I appreciate that. And she is right. Our role as the County Office of Ed is to remind all of our districts and our partners that this is the law, and then the implementation gets trickier, right? But that's where reaching out to the liaison and working with them directly, they'll be able to provide you more support or provide the family the support directly. Next slide. So we have a scenario, and that is you are working with a 12th grader who is on track to graduating. However, the family has since moved out of the district. What education-based assistance can be offered? And Gina, you could blame Gina. This one's a tricky one to get you to think. We want you thinking at almost 11 o'clock in the morning on a Monday after spring forward. Any thoughts on this one? Well, let me ask a more direct question. Oh, let's see. I think there's someone put something. Transportation to remain in the school of origin. Absolutely. Especially they're a 12th grader, right? So that means they're on their last year depending on what month. It could be that they are about a week away from graduating. It could be 2 months away from graduating. So ensuring that they stay in school of origin and graduate will be definitely a priority. Continue the school they are attending since they are getting ready to graduate. Yep, agree. Transportation.
Can I add in that we're all saying we want to transport them so they can finish there. It's not always an option because sometimes it's too far away, and sometimes
is
they
true.
also are not willing to get up that early to get there on time, right? So when we cannot transport because that is not really a reasonable option for the student or for expenses or for whatever the things are, making sure that we transfer their grades over to the new school so they can either get partial credits for the work that's been completed, or they can then build on what they have done and then finish the semester at the new school. So both of those would be options too. But students do have access to partial credits. I don't think we had a slide for that.
We did it,
Alejandra.
yeah, you're right.
So if a student transfers because they're McKinney-Vento, then they do have a right to those partial credits for the work that was completed before the transfer.
And again, we don't expect you to remember all of that portion, but making sure you're letting know the school of origin district liaison and school of residence district liaison, then they could work together to ensure that the credits get moved successfully and or transportation is figured out. Acknowledging that any kiddo who has to be commuting more than an hour, but it's worth getting all the partners together and having a conversation. I think that's what I would encourage you all to think about, because it would all depend on, who's the kiddo, how close are they to graduating, how motivated are they, what kind of transportation are we talking about? How early they have to get, up and going? Is it with traffic, against traffic? And so that's what this meeting would allow you all to do. And that is the best interest determination meeting. So a bid. Bids usually happen quite a bit on the foster side. On the homeless, we're still encouraging them. And so Rosie is one who does hold bids for our McKinney-Vento students. And I encourage you all that if a situation like this happens, that you just loop in the liaison, loop in Gina or myself, and we're happy to support. Yeah, absolutely. If they are 18, you would definitely take in consideration what they want, because they are considered their own ed rights holders. So that is very important. Next slide, and I'm going to hand it off to Gina.
Okay, so unaccompanied youth. Who are they and what does it mean? So unaccompanied youth are children and youth that are not in the physical custody of a parent or guardian. So while a student may not be in the physical custody of their parent or guardian, a parent can still have legal custody and a child or student not be in the home, making them unaccompanied. With that, a guardianship issue alone does not automatically qualify a student to be identified as McKinney-Vento or eligible for services. So my point is a student can be homeless under the McKinney-Vento Act. They can also be unaccompanied. Next slide, please. This graphic just further illustrates my point. So you really have 3 buckets here. You are going to encounter students that are experiencing homelessness. You'll have your students who are not in the physical custody of their parent or guardian, so they'd be identified as unaccompanied. And then you'll have a pocket of students who are homeless and unaccompanied. In order to be eligible and identified as a homeless unaccompanied youth, they do need to meet both the criteria for homeless and unaccompanied. Next slide. So how do our youth become unaccompanied? A lot of times we see that youth leave the home due to just simply lack of space. Families are already living in tight living quarters, and oftentimes our older youth are either forced from the home or just asked to leave. There's not enough room. You're old enough to stay with someone else, stay with a friend, but there's not enough room for you here. Or they're leaving the home to go out and get jobs in order to help support the family. If a youth does end up at a shelter, shelters often have limited stays, typically 30, 60, 90-day options. And then that youth would have to figure out a new plan and reset. Youth often leave the home due to family dysfunction. So over 2/3 of hotline calls report at least one parent is using drugs or alcohol in the home. About 1/3 of homeless youth identify as being part of the LGBTQIA+ community, and about 10% of homeless teens are pregnant. Next slide. So we have another case scenario. So let us know what you guys think. So we have Celia. She's 15. She has a mom who struggles with substance abuse. And because of that, she often has strangers in the home and participates in some activities that are causing Celia to feel anxious and uncomfortable. So eventually, Celia concluded that she would be safer living on her own. She ran away and she's now sleeping on the streets in downtown Antioch. Celia is not currently attending school, but she wants to re-enroll as soon as possible. So my first question to the group is Celia an unaccompanied youth? Yes, no, not sure, need more information. What do you guys think? I'm seeing some yeses. Yes, Celia would be, oh, lots of yeses. Celia, yes, would be considered an unaccompanied youth. My second question, what resources or education-based assistance can be offered? Because we know Celia wants to go back to school. So what direction could we point her in when it comes to her education? What do you think? Transportation, immediate school enrollment. Oh, we love context. So using the official terms with immediate enrollment, housing first, school enrollment, determining if there's relatives she can stay with. Yeah, so getting Celia off the street, out of downtown Antioch. So can she couch surf? Is there somewhere she can stay? Shelter, so looking into youth shelters, limited number of youth shelters at the moment, but we're working on that. What about getting Celia back in school? Who would we reach out to? What would we do? So oh, thanks, Rosie.
Rosie's like me.
As Alejandra mentioned earlier, this is that time again when you would just whip out your handy dandy liaison sheet or call Rosie.
Mhm.
So your liaison is really going to be your direct link to getting Celia back in school. All great answers. Thanks, everyone.
Next slide. So disputes. So now that we've provided you with the rights that students have in regards to immediate enrollment, as well as school of origin, graduation, exemption or credits exemption, and so forth. There is a dispute process that families can take when they disagree with whatever process is taking place, particularly as it regards to eligibility, school selection, and enrollment. And when the process of dispute happens, the liaison is expected to provide the documentation in regards to filling out the dispute. Particularly, the liaison will notify the family. It's part of our board policies, and then walk them through the process of what are the next steps. Meanwhile, the kiddos are to remain enrolled while the dispute is being resolved. And obviously, if The expectation is that if there is a dispute resolution happening, the liaison's already involved because most likely they would have been the person who provided the written explanation of the dispute and then walked them through the next steps. Very, very boilerplate. It's just standard. The liaisons provides the support. If for some reason it doesn't get resolved at the district level, it does come to the county office, which is to me. And then if that doesn't get resolved, it does go to the California Department of Education. Any questions or comments with regards to disputes? Next slide. Putting all the pieces together. So when we think about how we're all supporting each other's work, the next slides are going to provide some tips to help us think about that process. Next slide. So tips for you all as I consider the work that all of you are doing, as well as our liaisons. I often find myself in that middle trying to make sure I'm connecting both groups or both entities in a way that makes sense. And so for this particular group, I say familiarize yourself with the McKinney-Vento Act, which this presentation has provided in regards to how do we define homelessness, what are the rights of the kiddos, and how do we effectively work with districts, school sites to support children and youth with the intent of really supporting school stability. That's really what we want always. And sharing information and data on housing programs to increase awareness. So we encourage you all to have the posters, not, just like we have posters at our school sites. I'll be following up with, I think it was Victoria, around what school site they were at when they didn't see the posters. We don't need to call out our districts in this space. We'll do it privately. And that's not to call them out in a negative way. That's to call them out in a good way, like, oh, your posters are not up. But I encourage you all as providers, if you don't have those posters in your office, we're happy, Gina and I are happy to take posters so that not only are we increasing the awareness at school sites and district sites, but also in our community. Next slide. Become familiar with education challenges. So I know this presentation has made you aware of obviously school enrollment and how we could make that not a challenge, but it is a challenge and it can be, right? Just getting families to go through the process of going to the school site or the district or filling the online enrollment process and so forth. So asking your parents or the caregivers or ed rights holder, what's the challenge? And then working with us to identify how we could make that challenge go away, how we could remove the barriers. Invite the liaisons to any of your meetings or to present to your group. Some of our liaisons are more available than other liaisons, and that's okay. And if they're not available, Gina or myself are always happy to present to your agency or to a group of individuals for a staff meeting, you name it. Our intention is to obviously create the awareness, but when in doubt, the liaison is always good if he is in your community because you start to build that relationship. And then develop that process for really evaluating the best interest. So I know I had mentioned, what is in the best interest of the kiddo when we're thinking about school of origin, school of residency, when we're thinking about graduation, when we're thinking about, transportation, is when we're focused on serving the kiddos and keeping in mind best interest, what is in their best interest. I think we could make sure that school stability is done successfully. Next slide. And then, of course, MOUs. Who doesn't love a great MOU? I do. Jamie knows that. Often that might not be the case for a particular agency. I'm going to pick on Shelter Inc. No offense to Shelter Inc. or anything, but Shelter Inc., if you're, locally in Mount Diablo Unified School District, would it be helpful to have a MOU with Mountain D with the intent of working with the families, the children and youth more intentionally. Maybe, maybe not. But it does give an opportunity to pilot some work, to think about how two different agencies collaborate, and to take the time to look at process, protocols, procedures, all with the intent of supporting children and youth. And then often what happens is the County Office of Ed enters into an MOU on behalf of the districts to support them as a whole, to coordinate that effort. So if any of the agencies here are interested in working more closely with the school districts, but doesn't want to do it or provide that process district to district, reach out to me. I'm happy to explore ideas to do county work through a MOU. Next slide. And I think we covered this, but I'll reiterate. I mean, the importance of really identifying students is one, you can't serve them. We can't serve them. You know who they are, but we cannot serve them if we do not know who they are. And so it's great that you all know who are the children and youth who are experiencing homelessness. You're working with the families, but often if the district or the school site is not aware of it, then it's harder to provide that immediate enrollment. It's harder to provide the transportation and the graduation credit exemption. So identification is an important first step to ensure that the schools are able to provide all of these rights and services to them. And then, of course, it gives them all of the other services that we just reviewed. And then it makes us better partners, right? The more we identify, the more we're on the same page, the more we could collaborate and ensure that students stay in their school of origin. Next slide. Okay, Rosie, transferring it to you.
So I wanted to take a few minutes to talk a bit about navigating additional support for some of our students, especially if they've experienced trauma and maybe had interrupted schooling. We might be looking at situations where students might be in more need of more support, such as an IEP or a 504. We will also talk about some different agencies, state agencies and local agencies that can help assist through this process. Next slide, please. So the first most important thing to think about is, are we looking at supporting students informally? Maybe the student just needs extra tutoring. Maybe they've just missed a lot of school and they just need some additional reading tutoring, and we don't need to get them into the 504 IEP process. That's something that sometimes school districts can provide without even going down that road of 504 IEP. So I know in our school district, we have a contract with the Concord Community Youth Center. We pay for that. The students can do extracurriculars and get tutoring every day if they want to at CYC. And so those are the kinds of things that the school districts can do. If that's not enough and we need to go down this process, why is this still ringing? Oh, it's from one. No, okay, there we go. Then we would do an SST. An SST is a student success team, and then you would kind of talk through different options for the student, and that has to be the first process. I think a lot of times people want to just get an IEP, and it's slow. I work in the school district. I'm a school district administrator, and it took me about 9 months to get my own child's IEP solidified. There are timelines that we need to meet in terms of assessment and reporting out, but in terms of getting it so that the IEP was completely done and everybody agreed on all of the accommodations, I would say it really took about almost a whole school year. So know that it's like a long process with the SST, requesting the assessment and going through that. And I think helping families understand that it's a long process, managing those expectations is very important, because then we're not as frustrated along the way. We know that this is just kind of how it works. And I think it's important for us to help families understand that we don't just want to throw our students in special ed who don't actually need an IEP. Outcomes for students in special education are not amazing. And so we always want to try everything we can before we do work on getting an IEP for a student. And then once we have an IEP, making sure that they have the least restrictive environment. That often means there's a little while of struggle that we want to understand as part of that, as we figure out, well, what is that least restrictive environment? What does that look like? Can that student be successful in that environment? So the IEP is the individualized education plan or individualized education program. It could mean either. This is based on law. It's federal law. McKinney-Vento and IDEA are both right up here as federal law that does trump that state law if there's ever kind of a dispute. So that's IDEA. And the purpose is to provide that specialized instruction, accommodations, support services for students with disabilities. The student must have one of 13 disabilities. So they're very specific to have an IEP for special education. There is one classification called OHI, other health impairment, which is a little bit more broad in those 13. And so, like I said, there's different services. It could be, occupational therapy. It could be speech therapy. It just depends on really what the student needs. They might have a period of pull-out support. They might spend their entire day in a special education setting or most of their day. So that would all be worked out through the IEP process, and that's a team decision, including the educational rights holder. Or so that could be the parent, that could be the student. We typically try to assign a surrogate parent. If it's a teenager, it's called a legal surrogate parent. If we cannot identify an educational rights holder, we can assign one through the county. And the process is reviewed every year. And then every 3 years, they retest the students to make sure that their levels haven't changed or see how they have changed and see how we need to adjust that IEP. Next slide, please. The 504 is much more broad, right? So the 504, you don't typically have a 504 in an IEP. I first started teaching in 2002, so I'm dating myself a little bit. In 2002, you'd often see students who had an IEP for speech and language disability, and then they would have a 504 for a physical ailment or for ADHD. Now we typically merge those two. So once you have an IEP, the 504 tends to go away. So you typically have one or the other. So we have the law, the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and it does ensure equal access to education. So that's where we have accommodations. We don't necessarily have services like therapies. We don't necessarily have a period of pull-out support, but maybe the student has extended time on testing. Maybe the student gets has to go to the bathroom more frequently, and they have a specialized bathroom pass because of a health ailment, that kind of thing. So the plan details, again, it's just like an IEP in that it is worked out with an administrator, the educational rights holder. Often the students will go for both the IEP or the 504 if they're over the age of about 11 or 12, but that's kind of at the discretion of the educational rights holder. And again, that process is reviewed annually as well. Next slide, please. So it's this can be a challenging process for families to navigate. So I definitely would, if you have never used the Care Parent Network, the Care Parent Network can help provide educational advocates and really help families through this process. It's very challenging to understand all of the different things that are happening. And so having a family connected to that, and it's a free service, that free educational advocate, they're often volunteers who've gone through the process themselves. Sometimes they're retired special education teachers, and they can be really helpful through that process. So the link is there for getting started using the Care Parent Network. Next slide, please. The Regional Center of the East Bay, I might have a child myself who is a Regional Center client, and I will say that the typical process for the Regional Center, if it's 0 to 3 years old, the student will become a Regional Center client. And once the student becomes 3 years old, the Regional Center typically kicks the student to the school district. They want the school district to pick up the services. And then you have to reapply to go back to the Regional Center. That is a pain because that reapplication to the Regional Center, again, takes almost a year. So that's as fast as I've ever seen it go, is maybe 8 months. So again, managing those expectations, knowing it's a long process, but it's really worth it because once you get those Regional Center services, you can get camps for your kids, and that can be really, really helpful for our families if they're staying in a shelter over the summer. Now their kids are going to day camps that are paid for by the Regional Center. Respite care. For me, having a child with disabilities, it's been just life-changing because I need a break sometimes, right? Sometimes mama needs that respite care and mama needs that break. And imagine some of our families who are staying in a shelter, they're staying in a car with their child and they never get a break. So having that respite care can be really, really helpful too. Also daycare so we can start work, and that can all be paid for by the Regional Center. So while it is a long process, it's definitely worth doing. And know that many families may have been Regional Center clients, but they may have been dropped when they turned 3, but then you can get them restarted. You also might have an adult with a disability, and the best way to get an adult with a disability services, potentially income, potentially housing, is often through that Regional Center services as well. Next slide, please. IHSS, I don't know if you're familiar with IHSS. This can be for caring for a child. Right here, this slide talks about how the family, the person who receives the services would need to be Medi-Cal eligible. So often it could be an older person or it can be a younger person. Sometimes we have somebody who's caring for a grandparent, or maybe they're caring for a child with more severe disabilities, and they kind of need that constant care and support. So then the parent or a family member could receive income for caring for that family member who they were already serving before anyway for free. So that could be a great revenue source for our families who we're trying to get them housed. If we can get them IHSS payments, and again, there's always a little process to get it going, but once you get it going, it's pretty amazing. So I gave you the link for that one there too. Next slide, please. Yeah, significant income, absolutely, that definitely. Yes. Okay, good. So Jamie's saying that she has done it. It works. My mom does it for my grandpa who's 90. I mean, and then she also used to do it for my nephew who she adopted, who had more severe disabilities. He's now a grown up, but it can be a really important source of income for our families. The Social Security representative payee is also really important. We just had a student last week who is a trans student who's 18, who is kicked out of their house, and their parent used to be their Social Security payee. And so then now this student has income. They just don't have access to it because it was going through their parent. So now who's going to be the payee for that person? There's a system that the state sets up to designate a payee so that the student would still have access to their income. Next slide, please. I'm going to pass it back to Alejandra to close us out.
All right. Well, we are at a point where we want you to take some time to provide some, we'll put the QR code, or not the QR code, but put the link in the chat so that you can provide us feedback. I know, Jamie, you also have yours, right? So either or, we could go in that direction, and Jamie, you could just share the outcome so that it helps us plan for next year.
Sure. I see a question about IHSS. I was going to jump in and answer.
And as I say, we're going to open it up for questions. So go
they're
ahead,
jumping on it.
Rosie.
It's great. So the IHSS will pay once they're staying in a shelter. So they don't have to have a permanent address. But like even if it's a moving shelter like Winter Nights, you can get them IHSS payments, but they do need to be attached to a shelter.
I have a question just about undocumented students and or families. And especially given the current climate, I know some schools are experiencing families that are being deported. Is there anything you can say sort of about what's available to families or things that they should be thinking about if they're not have members that are undocumented?
So I'm working on that for the Mount Diablo Unified School District. So we have been really trying to educate our families. The Know Your Rights materials, I can send those to you, Jamie, to send out with everyone. So we're going around to all of the ELACs, that's the English Learner Advisory Committees, and the DLACs, the District English Learner Advisory Committees, trying to teach students that way and families that way. We're going into classes to teach students. We're doing as many things as we can to make sure that families know their rights about, who to answer questions to. Do they need to open the door? The difference between an administrative warrant and a judicial warrant, knowing that a judicial warrant, you can enter the home, an administrative warrant, you can't enter the home if you don't have permission from the person who lives there to do it. You don't even open the door. So those are the kinds of things that we're working constantly to try to inform our families about. We also are trying to help our families do a family preparedness plan, and that's really great. So I'll send you, and I have translations in English, Spanish, and Dari of all of these materials. But the family preparedness plan is really a key because let's say the parent is detained due to immigration-related reasons. What are we going to do for that student? Do they have caregivers already authorized? Do we have a lot of contacts in the Aries contact for the school so that if the parent doesn't show up to pick up the kid, we can go through and call a lot of different people who know that they might be called in this situation, who would come pick up the child so that we do not have to call CPS. So those are some resources that we try to share with our students and families so that they're kind of ready and prepared, because the phrase that we keep using is power, not panic, right? Let's make sure that we're prepared so that we don't need to be, just living in fear all of the time.
And I'm just going to make a quick note. I put it in the chat, but we actually did a training last year about how to support undocumented clients. So I've dropped the slide deck and it also has a link to the recording in the chat. And also I'll just mention this training is being recorded. We're going to send out the slide deck from this and a recording link to everyone after this training. So don't worry, you're going to get all this. Sorry, carry on.
Thank you, Rosie. Other questions?
There's no questions.
I guess not. I guess we did an awesome job.
Covered it.
We covered it all.
If you're feeling shy too, you could send one of us a question in the back chat and we could say it out loud if you're feeling self-conscious about asking a question. There are no stupid questions, by the way. I can guarantee you every time somebody asks a question, somebody else is like, I wanted to ask that, but I was feeling kind of too shy.
Yeah, for me, everything was just explained so thoroughly, and I really appreciate the time and effort that you put into this.
We have a
You're
question.
It's more of a comment. I really appreciated this training. I grew up as a McKinney-Vento student myself. And it was McKinney-Vento that actually set up my ability to go to college for free. So this has been wonderful, and as somebody who has benefited greatly, I really appreciate this training, and it has been really informative for me as, you know, now on the other side, really seeing all the work that goes into supporting homeless students. And, you know, I'm just really grateful that, you know, the work is continuing on and it seems to be a lot stronger nowadays. So I appreciate it.
Thanks for sharing that.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I just want to
Wonderful.
add, that's really important. I'm glad you said that. The we didn't talk at all about financial aid. So we try to provide
Yeah.
every senior with a letter saying that they were unhoused, or we say meets the legal definition for homelessness, because even if they don't go to college the next year, they're 26, they decide they want to go to college when they were, you know, in high school, that still helps them. It still helps them. So we try to always give them the letter digitally, but make sure that you talk to them too. If you're working with a person who's a senior, and like, even if you don't want to go to college, take that letter and save it,
Yeah.
because it can really help with financial aid. And I was a McKinney-Vento youth too. So high
Yeah,
five.
yeah, no,
Yeah.
it's funny you say that, because I ended up going to community college for about like a good 5-6 years before I actually
Mm.
transferred to a 4-year college and had all of that paid for.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's a huge benefit that I would encourage everybody to share also.
Thank you. We appreciate you sharing that and hearing about the difference that someone being mindful around your success in education made a difference.
I'm curious to know if there are any situations that any of you are having where you're stuck because you don't know what the answer is, or you don't know what the next step is, versus like there's just not enough resource. Are there any of you that have been running into roadblocks and now you feel like, oh, I think I now know what that next step might be?
I have a question. My question is kind of very specific. I have a family who has established residency, has established a permanent fixed location for a year, and then moved to a new location after a year, another permanent fixed location. They have been in those established locations for 2 years, almost 2 years total. It'll be 2 years in like another month. How does a family then exit out of the McKinney-Vento being identified as McKinney-Vento? As I understand, they get 2 years of services after being exited, but I'm just trying to figure out how to transition them to not being McKinney-Vento.
So I don't know where you heard they have 2 years of service, because it's just to the end of the school year. So they at the end of the school year, I don't know how different districts do it. I know for us, their eligibility is put in through the last day of the school year. And then for the following year, we need to re-identify the students. There's not like another year after they've had a fixed address.
So with that in mind, every district is required to identify and then certify. Some carry it over from one year to another. Some do carry it over, but also do their process to call every family, confirm whether they still are eligible for the support. So it is a year to year, but it sometimes, you know, liaisons are very swamped. And so it might be one of those things where they just transfer it from one year to another and slowly go through all the families. My question to you would be, if they're being identified and the intent is to no longer be identified, that can be easily resolved by having the family reach out to the district and say, I'm no longer McKinney-Vento. Can you please indicate that in the system? And the liaison, any other liaisons would be able to go into the system and untag per se, and then they would no longer be identified as a McKinney-Vento family. And at any point, if they do again experience housing instability, they could reach out to the liaison and identify themselves as experiencing homelessness. I'm wondering, it sounds like the family does not want to be identified anymore. Is that correct?
I think the family wants to continue to be identified. They were last identified in a different school district in 22-23. The student is now transitioning to high school, and we're a high school district. So they were identified in the last school district in 22-23. There was no other identification after that point. They were in a permanent fixed location where they paid rent for a year and then moved to another location, which is also permanent, and it's just under a year. And I think that the family would like to continue to be identified as McKinney-Vento as they transition the student into high school. And there are some other things that are kind of happening. There's an IEP and some other things that are happening. And it's just difficult to figure out, especially from the other school district, as they transition into our school district, at what point were they maybe not being identified correctly. So yeah, that's kind of where we are right now. The family is under the impression and has advocates that are under the impression that because they've been in this last location for less than a year, then they are able to transition over as McKinney-Vento, which is fine if that's the case, but I'm just not certain of where to go with that.
That's a good one. So I think obviously we'll have to speak offline to get into the nitty-gritty of it. But in a nutshell, then it becomes of are they in a fixed, regular, and adequate? Like, are they eligible for identification under McKinney-Vento? And is that you as the district of origin or district of residency that needs to identify them? And then what is the service that they are asking for? Like often what we find is our families, and I won't say our families because some of them are not really experiencing housing instability, and the district has a sense that they're not being clear, and that's not often who we're talking about, right? We're actually when I'm putting on my hat as a McKinney-Vento liaison to the whole county, we find that our families who are really advocating are really experiencing housing instability. Here and there will be some families that are, for lack of words, are using the system just to have a benefit for getting into a particular school site or whatever the case is. So if that is what your intuition is giving you a sense that there might be some of that, then there is obviously processes that districts can take. But we always say our job is to immediately enroll. And if the family is enrolled and provided the services, then afterwards you could go down the due diligence of what you would do as a district to ensure that they are in compliance with whatever it is, whether it's eligibility for McKinney-Vento, whether it's graduation exemption or whatever the case may be. Rosie, I can sense that you have something more to add. Do you want to add something?
Well, I think there is just that misunderstanding. What you said, Stephanie, I think is the misunderstanding a lot of people have, that like there's a certain amount of time after getting secure housing that you would still have the right to you know, these benefits of being a McKinney-Vento student. And really it's just until the end of the year. And I will say that what you're talking about with the family wanting to go to a particular high school is not uncommon. And so that's often the reason people want to continue to be considered McKinney-Vento. They're not McKinney-Vento because they have access to fixed, regular, and adequate housing. And it's now a new school year, and it's a 1 school year eligibility. Like Alejandra said, not every school district has the bandwidth to call every family and rescreen the families. So I think sometimes people are like, well, why doesn't this district do it? And I'm like, I call the liaison, I'm like, why don't you do it? She's like, because I'm only one person, you have a whole team, right? So I think a lot of it is really a bandwidth issue of why they're not being rescreened each year. But like technically the law is that they would be rescreened each year. And if at the start of the school year, they have access to fixed, regular, and adequate housing, they would not be McKinney-Vento for that year unless something happened in the middle of the year and then they became unhoused again, right? I think that the key here, though, is it doesn't mean they wouldn't be eligible for an interdistrict transfer, right? So if the student is in good standing, if they're a kid, I'm going to tell you, if they're a kid who was formerly McKinney-Vento, who gets good grades, goes to school, doesn't have behavior problems, they're going to want to move that student into the school as long as there's space for it. It's just if the student is like, we've had a lot of behavioral issues, we have not been attending school, we have not done well here, and we're not McKinney-Vento, we don't necessarily have the right to go there if we want to go there. We kind of have to ask, and then usually it gets granted if they're doing well. And like, well does not have to mean straight A's. Let's be very clear here.
Yeah.
We're talking about like not a lot of F's here. We're not talking about a lot of F's. We're talking about like C student or better and attend school most of the time, 90% or more, and does not have a lot of suspensions. Like that's what we're looking at. And then we would typically try to honor that as long as there's space.
Thank you for your question. And we're happy to talk offline if you want to explore a little bit more, or if you're having some concerns about next steps. But again, fixed, regular, and adequate. Okay.
Any other questions that folks have?
I would say those in the weeds ones are the best ones because those are like the real things we deal with every day. So thank you, Stephanie. That was great.
I was just gonna touch on this question about unaccompanied minors. So the data we have in our homeless system of care is that we don't have a lot of unaccompanied minors. We really only have one service provider that can provide shelter. So that's Northern California Family Center. And so often what happens is young people get referred out to like dream catchers in Oakland. And that obviously like I just think about that as a challenge between like, not only are they geographically really far if they're a dream catchers, but then they're like in a whole different county. So I don't know how often that comes up or what.
All the time.
Yeah.
Like, I'll let Rosie.
So where do we put them? They don't have any. If they're 18, we can send them to different places out of county. But if they're 16, 17 with nowhere to go, we're really, really, really stuck. And so it's extremely
challenging. That's good to know. So Stephanie just said dream catchers is not taking minors anymore. So
no,
really,
they don't. We don't have anywhere for minors, and they have to be 18. And so that's really, really hard for our students. And so we end up having to like do a family tree and a connections tree to figure out like, okay, while unideal, is there anybody here who might take you? Because, but then if we're looking at our students who are newly immigrated to this country, like our unaccompanied homeless youth who just got here from Guatemala, and there truly is no one, it's a really tricky situation because I'm going to say that if they go into the child welfare system, that's probably going to be sent back to Guatemala, and that's not what they want. So yeah, I don't have an answer for you, but yeah, I could tell you it's a great question and it's definitely a needed resource.
Rosie, on average, how many cases like that do you have in a year?
So we have about 50 unaccompanied homeless youth, maybe 40 this year. I think it's a little less than last year, 40 unaccompanied homeless youth. And most of those students are students who came from another country. And so like legal sponsorship that went awry, like they had a legal sponsor and that legal sponsor is just not their legal sponsor anymore. They don't have anybody who's taking care of them. Most of those students, we do manage to find somebody else in the community, whether it's like a distant auntie or someone who can help take that student in and help them get through at least to the end of the year, if not to graduation. But I'd say there's maybe 3, 4 who like I mean, I've had to take students to the Concord there was one kid who just turned, they were with Northern California Family Center, like you were saying. And then once they're 18, on their 18th birthday, they're kicked out of that. And so then we had to take them to the Concord shelter for adults over on Industrial Way. And they have to leave at 6 in the morning every day and then take the bus over to school and then shower at school. And because that student had just turned 18. So yeah, it's extremely challenging for us to support our youth. And I'd say even more if they're not 18.
Thank you, Rosie. That has been a continued gap in our community. And, you know, we're figuring it out, but we're definitely not youth focused in the sense of creating spaces that they feel safe in. And even most of our youth who are in East County or Central County going outside of our county or other parts, it's not ideal, but there's nothing else.
Sorry, didn't mean to be Debbie Downer.
No, I mean, that's where we're at, right? Like, yeah.
And
I
with those
see.
students too, we also see pretty high rates of potential exploitation. So if the students are, if they came into the country with a legal sponsorship agreement, that legal sponsor agreed to pay for their rent. They shouldn't have to pay any rent. They shouldn't have to pay any of their legal fees or anything like that. But we are seeing many students who have to pay upwards of $1,000 a month in either rent or paying back a immigration related debt, which is child trafficking and exploitation. So I will say that's actually one way we've helped some of these students is if they're unaccompanied homeless youth who are not working, then we're like, I don't know what I have for you. The ones who are having to work a lot, and that's an exceptional amount of money to have to pay back to somebody. So then we have different avenues that we can use to report it as human trafficking. And then there's support services for housing for those students if that's the situation.
Yeah, actually, that reminds me. So hopefully folks know, but there is a human trafficking coalition that meets quarterly, and those meetings are amazing. And they talk a lot about commercially sexually exploited youth, but also around labor trafficking. And actually, labor trafficking is more common in our county than sexual trafficking. But I can drop a link in there. They have really, really like useful trainings and presenters that I think, especially if we think about our young people that are very vulnerable. I'll find that information and drop it in here.
And know that they originally created the CSEC team for child welfare, like commercially sexually exploited children, just for sex exploitation, like Jamie was saying. But now they're finding, like she was saying, that it's so much of it is labor trafficking. So you would still use that same organization, that the CSEC, for anything that was like, okay, the student is having to work. They have to miss school to go to work because they have to pay a debt. If they have missed school to go to work because they have to pay their rent, that's all considered labor trafficking. They shouldn't have to do that. And I was also going to say there's also OTIP, which is the Office of Trafficking in Persons, and that's a national organization, and they have resources as well. So both county and national. And you can also always call me too. So like, even though I'm not part of the county and you might not be part of Mount Diablo Unified School District, you might be like, Rosie, where's that link for OTIP? And I can just shoot it over to you. So my email address, I'll put it right here in the chat. I think it might be already went in there, but definitely feel free to reach out anytime, even if you're not affiliated with MDUSD.
And I just dropped in the chat to the Employment and Human Services website for commercially sexually exploited children. And if you go down the page, it has a 24-hour crisis line to CVS that you could call, and some more resources there.
And I finally found the coalition website. I'm going to put it in here. The first one didn't have a line.
Again, a reminder of how collaborating, coordinating, and coming together as a community, we could do more to serve our children and youth.
Any other questions, comments? Hey, I think you'll get 14 minutes of your life back.
Enough time to
Awesome.
transition.
Yes, you have time to transition. Oh, yes. Please make sure that you're stepping away from your computer in those 15 minutes. Take a break, go outside, walk around your office, go talk to a human in 3D.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a beautiful day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so very
Thank
much.
you.
Certainly appreciate your time.
You're welcome.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
you.
Thank you so much. So appreciate it.
Okay, I'm gonna close this out. Thanks,
Thank-
everybody.
Thank you, Jamie.